Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the Tortoise COVID inquiry. I'm Matt Denko, and I'm an editor at Tortoise. I'm delighted that you could join us for this session, and indeed we hope as much of this day as you can. This session we're kicking off with today is, I think, a very interesting one. It's titled "The Prime Minister," deliberately so that we can look at the specifics of Boris Johnson's response, but also look at the office of Prime Minister and how what systemic learnings there might be from what has happened since the pandemic hit this country. Just for those of you who haven't been to any of our previous sessions in the inquiry, it's slightly different from the traditional Tortoise thinking model in that we have a sort of judicial approach almost, or not judicial, but barristerial approach with Rok Glovacki, who's a very distinguished media and technology lawyer who will make a prosecutorial case. And then my fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, Alexi Mostras, who in addition to being a brilliant journalist, is infuriatingly also a brilliant lawyer. Don't know quite how he did that, but he did. And so he'll be in honor of his previous profession, making the case for. And so we'll kick off with that, the two lawyers making presentations, and then we'll come to the excellent speakers we have and witnesses who will chew over how the Prime Minister handled this particular emergency, and indeed is handling it to this day. So we hope you'll be able to participate too. Keep an eye on the chat, which is being overseen by my colleague Luca Damer. And I hope that you enjoy it. Rob, can I, without further ado, hand over to you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone at Tortoise for having me as part of this inquiry. While I am not a litigator or a prosecutor by trade, I thought it's probably the first and only time in my career that I'll have the opportunity to simulate the prosecution of an acting Prime Minister. So thank you for the challenge, and thank you for the note that have been provided by the team in advance of this session. And the prosecution's case against the Prime Minister is rather simple. The Prime Minister is indeed asleep at the wheel, unfit to lead the country. In fact, one could argue that the Prime Minister has acted negligently, as he has departed from the conduct expected of a reasonably prudent person acting under similar circumstances. And while these are, as we have all repeatedly heard, unprecedented times, the conduct of the Prime Minister falls well below the precedents and examples set by leaders of other countries. It has been widely reported since the emergence of the coronavirus threat in January that the Prime Minister missed 5 meetings of COBRA, the cross-departmental committee that comes together to respond to national emergencies. When leaders of other countries were taking decisive action, on 23rd of January, the central government of China imposes a local lockdown in Wuhan. On 31st of January, President Donald Trump signs a proclamation suspending entry into the United States of those who are physically present in the People's Republic of China. On 9th of March, Italy goes into lockdown. On 11th of March, the WHO characterized the coronavirus outbreak as a global pandemic. A day later, the Dutch Prime Minister announces the first set of measures for the Netherlands, called the intelligent lockdown. 13th of March, the Director General of WHO says that Europe has become the epicenter of the pandemic. On the same day, Slovakia, Malta, Czech Republic announced border closures. So does Poland. 15th of March, Spain begins its lockdown. The Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, told Spaniards that they were banned from leaving home except for work or essential travel. The later evening of 16th of March, French President Emmanuel Macron announces strict measures for the French. The French lockdown begins the next day. And these are just examples of swift or decisive actions taken by other leaders, no doubt based on the reactions of their European counterparts, not to mention those of their Asian counterparts. Meanwhile, at the beginning of March, the Prime Minister presents UK's action plan to tackle the virus: contain, delay, research, mitigate. We are told to sing happy birthday twice while washing our hands, and major sporting events such as the European Champions League game between Liverpool and Atletico Madrid, go ahead. Finally, the UK goes into lockdown on the 23rd of March. That's 2 weeks later than Italy and several days after many other European countries. And it is not just that the initial response was woeful, slow, indecisive, or confused. The Tortoise media team has helpfully summarized that Boris Johnson's government has made 14 U-turns and counting since the beginning of the pandemic. We could spend the entire hour discussing these, so I'll just point a few. In March, the government backs away from herd immunity as a national strategy after prompting widespread alarm among medical experts. In May, the Prime Minister drops the NHS surcharge for migrant health workers. Up until June, the government ministers and their advisors considered the evidence for using face masks to be too weak for them to be used by the public. It's only on 15th of June that masks become mandatory on public transport. Also in June, the government was forced to abandon the centralized coronavirus contact tracing app after spending almost 3 months working on it and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. More recently, the country has had to endure a second national lockdown, an idea that was dismissed by the Prime Minister just a few weeks before announcing the November lockdown. That's also despite a warning from SAGE about an increasing number of cases in the UK and a recommendation for a so-called circuit breaker. Boris Johnson leads a government that has consistently failed to adopt a coherent stance since the beginning of the year. According to the Health Foundation COVID-19 policy tracker, since 10th of January, the government has issued 136 policy updates on social distancing and other measures to contain the virus. Earlier in the year, the Prime Minister also tested positive for the coronavirus, probably as a result of shaking hands during many hospital visits and press conferences. The Prime Minister's ordeal with the virus led to many speculations about his health and the ability to lead the country, and whether he might still be suffering from long-term consequences of the illness. Whether that is true or not, a fundamental question remains. Why, given the examples set by other leaders of what is or might be reasonable to do in the circumstances, the Prime Minister has not only failed to lead by example, but has clearly failed to take the lead of those who know better?
Thank you very much, Rod. Over to you, Alexei.
Sorry, thank you, Matt. I'm just unmuting myself. Thank you. Boris Johnson has faced almost unrelenting criticism over his government's handling of the coronavirus crisis. Some have accused him of failing to lock down the country, not failing to lock down the country early enough. Others have said he shouldn't have locked down at all and adopted a laissez-faire attitude similar to Sweden's. Later on, the individual lockdown tiers introduced by Mr. Johnson were regarded as either too strict or too lax, or too confusing, depending on your politics or perhaps on what tier you lived in. This week, 54 members of Mr. Johnson's own party voted against the latest lockdown restrictions, while the opposition abstained. On COVID, it seems the political world has turned on its head. Economically, Mr. Johnson's government has spent £280 billion to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, an extraordinary amount and one praised by many neutral observers. But this was either a drop in the ocean, if you're the TUC, or the harbinger of unimaginable future debt, if you're a Telegraph columnist. The point I'm seeking to make here is that Boris Johnson was placed in an invidious position by the pandemic, which, lest we forget, was a crisis unprecedented in living memory. Not since the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 has any peacetime leader been forced to make so many painful decisions. So my first submission in Boris Johnson's defence is this: have some understanding of the difficulty he was put in. Think of his job like threading a minuscule needle, balancing public health with economic stability, personal safety with fiscal caution, and social wellness with private enterprise. And appreciate, if you will, that right up until this week's approval of a COVID-19 vaccine, there was no panacea for Johnson or indeed for any political leader. There were no objectively right answers. The Prime Minister could never shield any job, nor could he save every business. He could only pull levers and plug leaks. So how then do we measure his performance? How do we grade him? And this is one of the purposes of the inquiry, after all. To be honest, it's tough. The easy position to take would be to point to statistics that look bad, excess deaths, for instance, or falling trust in the government, and say, look, this clearly shows that the Prime Minister was asleep at the wheel. But it's our duty in this inquiry to look further, to go beyond the headlines, even if that means we come to a more muddled conclusion. The unsexy fact in all of this is that a myriad of other factors, structural, political, and economic, have to be taken into account. We also have to be aware, as one of our guests said at last week's COVID inquiry, not to apply the retrospectoscope to Johnson's actions, but to judge them as they were taken in the heat of the moment and when ministers knew they had to act fast. So let's look at a couple of these examples. Mr. Johnson's delay in implementing lockdown 1. Much has been made of him skipping COBRA meetings in January and February. He attended his first meeting on March the 2nd. The question is, was that reasonable behaviour? I say it was. Johnson's own scientific committee, SAGE, concluded on the 5th of February that shutting down public transport or restricting public gatherings would probably be ineffective. Risk levels were kept low almost all the way through February. It's easy to forget that back then we actually knew quite little about the virus's infection rates or its methods of transmission. It was only weeks later, in fact, 3 days after Mr. Johnson had attended a COBRA meeting, that scientists laid out the bold truth for him that sustained transmission of COVID-19 was highly likely in the United Kingdom. After that, Boris Johnson acted. My opponent compares him to other politicians in other countries. France, he says, locked down on the 16th of March. In fact, that's the same day that Matt Hancock told us that unnecessary social contact must cease. A full lockdown was put in place by Britain only 5 days later. Not much of a difference, I would suggest. The other thing to take into account is that for better or worse, Johnson is both a libertarian and an optimist. These qualities might not be best suited to deal with a pandemic, you might think, but it was on these characteristics that Johnson was elected, with a stonking majority. So perhaps it was predictable that this was a man who did not want to rush into a national lockdown, especially when the scientific advice was at best ambiguous. Let's look at another criticism levelled at Johnson. His administration must be inept, it is said, because Britain's level of excess deaths is higher than other European countries. But the reasons behind such figures are complex. Britain's relative obesity might have played a part. So might our position as a transport hub with a relatively denser population than the rest of Europe. Long-term structural deficiencies in the NHS and the care system no doubt contributed. Look at what Neil Ferguson, the Imperial University professor, said a few months ago. Surveillance in hospitals only really stood up in the second week of March, he said. Before that, we didn't have a good handle on the scale of the problem. The system, rather than the Prime Minister, may have been at fault here. So look, if you're being truly objective and you can separate yourself from a desire to blame a single individual, then the question of the Prime Minister's culpability becomes much more complex than is first obvious. That's not to say that there weren't mistakes in the government's approach. Contact tracing was abandoned when it almost certainly shouldn't have been. Although again, I should point out that SAGE's advice on the 11th of February was that it wasn't possible for the UK to accelerate coronavirus testing capacity alongside regular flu testing. I would suggest that SAGE has as many questions to answer in this inquiry as the government does. The Dominic Cummings affair is another black mark against Mr. Johnson and did lead to trust falling by measurable levels. Many would argue, with some justification, that that behaviour was inexcusable. But were the effects actually that great? Look at how the popularity of other European leaders moved over the same period. Many, like Johnson, enjoyed a bump when virus measures were first introduced and citizens came together in a common cause. Many have also seen their popularity ratings later fall off a cliff as people got more and more fed up with lockdown restrictions. President Macron's popularity, for instance, went from 66% in March to 29% last month. Johnson's own popularity has fallen in the same way, although not by as much. So now let's look at the good points. Critics have praised the government's economic response. Johnson seems to finally have got his act together over testing. We now carry out more tests than any country in Europe. The coordinated approach of the UK authorities has been praised by the IMF as one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. The latest national lockdown has brought the R rate below 1, and now Britain has become the first country to approve a coronavirus vaccine. Its pre-orders of more than 350 million doses have put it ahead of almost any other country. My point in these submissions is not that Mr. Johnson behaved perfectly. He has clear managerial weaknesses, and there's no doubt that the coronavirus itself left him physically weakened. But bald statistics about death rates, trust, testing, and the like cannot be laid completely at his door. The reality is much more nuanced.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lexi. Thank you. Can I turn immediately to Lord Gus O'Donnell, who is former Cabinet Secretary, and perhaps one of the best placed people to assist us with this particular question, because he worked for Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. Gus, can I ask you, first of all, thank you for joining us today, and let's look at the sort of the beginnings of this, start at the beginning, because Boris Johnson emerges from, as Alexi said, from a triumphant general election. He's at least got the UK out of the EU without yet a trade deal on January the 31st this year, and he's presumably feeling that he's already established himself in political history as a winner. So there's something hugely counterintuitive about what's about to happen in his mind in February and thereafter. So how do you, having seen up close how his predecessors dealt with crises, admittedly of a very different character, how do you judge his performance in those first crucial weeks? I mean, bearing in mind that subsequently, many people, including Neil Ferguson, the Science and Technology Committee in June, said that the speed of lockdown was essential in determining the number of mortalities. We should have locked down earlier. Address the question of perhaps of him missing COVID meetings. I mean, how reasonable is it to criticise him on those and other points?
Right, thank you very much. I think this is a complex case, but certain things are worth saying. First of all, number one, as you pointed out, this is a relatively inexperienced prime minister, right? He comes in, hasn't been in post very long, and hasn't had experience of dealing with crises. Wasn't a minister during the global financial crisis or any of those other ones. Wasn't around really during anything like foot and mouth and all the rest of it. Any prime minister, you will find when you look back on the evidence, does a lot better the second time, right? If we had this again, he'd do a lot better. Secondly, he gets ill. Now, yes, some of the behaviors, shaking hands and all the rest of it, weren't great, but it is worth saying that number 10 is a bit like a TARDIS. It looks small from the outside. Inside, it's much bigger, but it's very small and crowded, right? I mean, it became known internally as the plague pit, right? It's very hard for them to have meetings with all the right people there. and indeed, he became ill. The other point is it's a very difficult crisis, right? He had to do something which has at its heart a health issue, and then actually use measures, which are lockdown measures, which are basically social and economic. And so you need the two together. So I'd say those are the mitigating factors. Where he went wrong, you've had various references to Cobra. Cobra is brilliant for a terrorist-style attack, right? For a short, sharp crisis response. It's completely the wrong vehicle for something like COVID, okay? You really want, first of all, to be thinking about what kind of structures do I need? The National Security Council would be a much better model. You need the experts and the politicians round the same table. You need to think about the evidence base. There was a lot happening. People have pointed out this hit other countries first. We should have been learning from them. We should have realized very early on that we were very, very short on evidence. So the first thing the Prime Minister should have done, people go on about lockdown at the time, he should have said, you guys in Sage know very, very little, right? So what are the things unambiguously we can say? And I see someone saying that there was this attacking happy birthday was wrong. That's absolutely right. Wash your hands was very clear. There were certain things that were unambiguously good to say, and they got those across. The messaging was quite good about stay at home. It was very clear, people understood it. But they didn't know the prevalence of this. So the ONS should have been up there doing random sampling, which they eventually got to, far too late. We should have had the behavioural insights team in there. Everyone's referred to SAGE, completely the wrong vehicle, in my view. I would not have wanted to have SAGE as the key operator in all of this, have the central role, because you need some health stuff, but all of the things you're using are about to control it, are changing behaviour. So you need your behavioural experts, you need your treasury, you need the economy people in there, you need people telling you what happens when you start schools, what are the social implications, what we learned from Asia, what we learned from other experiences. So really, the thing the Prime Minister got basically wrong was the strategic framework, the strategy, no framework. How do you balance off these things? Didn't have any idea how to do that. So I think it was a very inexperienced Prime Minister and cabinet that didn't actually collect the evidence and ask the questions which would have revealed the degree of uncertainty and found ways to reduce that uncertainty. People have talked about masks. The thing about masks was, to this day, there's great uncertainty about it, but it seemed like a no-brainer to do it on things like public transport. It might have no effect, but it might have some good effect. And I would say the communication stuff, if you compare and contrast Boris Johnson with Nicola Sturgeon through this, and I would dispute Alexi's line about Cummings. I mean, the evidence is very clear. The Cummings episode created a dip, which wasn't observed anywhere else. There are long-term trends about comms, but there's a very clear dip on that episode. So that had an impact. But in terms of his ability to get across, when you ask in Scotland, people understood the rules. Much higher proportion of people knew what the rules were, understood them. Nicola Sturgeon's leadership ratings came through this very high. Whereas fundamentally, excess deaths in Scotland and the UK, much the same. The outcomes, not very different. And yet she has come across as a political leader that's been there and led the way. Whereas our Prime Minister, I'm afraid, has come across as someone who's relying on others, the scientists, and again, very little social science in there. People at times were given statistics which were wildly misleading. I mean, that as well. The scientists should have said, these death numbers, leaving out care homes. I mean, doing comparisons with other countries, but when they start to look wrong, you drop them. I mean, when you have the government being attacked by the statistics regulator for seriously misleading people, then something's gone wrong with communication. So I'd say where the Prime Minister is at fault was not setting up the right strategy, not setting up the right frameworks to implement that. And I'd give him the mitigation of having been ill and having been inexperienced and not, but I mean, my biggest fault was we didn't learn and we didn't do enough to try and create evidence to find out more about what we should have done.
I guess just to drill down into the point about international comparisons, it's very interesting because the point that was made really quite early on was that countries that have been through SARS did better. Now, Whitehall is awash with people who knew that and would have been saying that. So what puzzles me is why something that was frankly being written about daily in the newspapers, which is this is a SARS cousin rather than a flu. Why wasn't that message getting through to the PM? Look, this is the model to follow. Was it resistance on his part, or a systemic failure, or both?
To be honest, I honestly don't know, because the links we have, I'm a fellow with the Singapore Civil Service College. We have very close links with these countries. We know a lot about what they do. Their idea about locking down early. Singapore didn't shut the schools, right? But they were very, very good at test and trace. One of the things they did, if you're getting people to isolate, a basic economic message. If you want people to isolate, make sure that there's every economic incentive for them to do it. So they paid them their wage. Very simple, straightforward thing to do. We didn't. So where were the incentives for people to actually obey the rules? and you can see this in people turning off the NHS app when they go out and actually meet people. So, I think there were failures in test and trace, which were right at the beginning, which we could have learned from others. I don't know why we didn't do that learning. It seems to me pretty obvious, and this isn't with hindsight. This is at the time. One could see that there were things we could learn and do, which for some reason we didn't. So I don't know why they didn't get through to the Prime Minister.
I mean, it's a difficult question, Gus, because you obviously haven't worked for the current PM, but you did work for three very different PMs. And how important is the psychology of the Prime Minister, the kind of innate character in these situations? Because I imagine that in situations of intense pressure, psychological characteristics become more important.
Yes, and I'd give you two examples. Working with Tony Blair, Tony Blair really loved crises, actually, and he would get very involved, and he was very keen on action, and he loved the idea during the second foot and mouth of bringing in the army. Let's get it sorted. Gordon Brown during the global financial crisis. That played incredibly well to someone who'd been a chancellor for a long time and who had this big vision, saving the world, and operated through the EU. I mean, this is an interesting dimension that plays into the European debate. Gordon very much worked to get that G20 going. That's another aspect of your inquiry you might want to look at. When you look at that Excel Centre that's got a Nightingale Hospital in it, that's basically been empty all the time in London, that was where Gordon Brown brought the world leaders together. And why was it that actually world leadership, we would have been trying it with a functioning G20 and world leadership system to have something sorted out in advance about how you allocate out vaccines in terms of need rather than in terms of who happens to have made them. None of those things seem to have happened now. Partly that's because the whole G20 system fell down with President Trump, who wasn't interested in it. So you can't blame our Prime Minister alone, but I don't think we were pushing very hard on that.
Thank you, guys. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Charlotte Pickles, who is Director of the excellent think tank Reform. Morning, Charlotte, and thank you for joining us. Can I ask, to what extent, it's always interesting in this setting to look at the balance between personality and system. And when you look back on where we've come from, where we are now, to what extent do you attribute the Prime Minister's performance, failures, successes to himself, and how much to the system of government within which he works?
I think that's a great question. And we've already heard from different people that clearly it has to be a bit of both. I think there's no doubt that, and if you read anything about Boris Johnson and his personality and sort of how he operates as an individual, then there are several things which I guess haven't been helpful, or as helpful as we might have liked during this sort of crisis. So, he's not known for being particularly interested in kind of combing through detail. And whilst there's always a balance, I think, in leadership roles, you don't want someone who's going to be so stuck in the detail that they can't make decisions and see the bigger picture. But in something like this, you do need someone who's going to be abreast of all of the key information and the levers that you have to be able to pull. You've also got someone and people who know him very well. I don't personally, but people I've spoken to who do would say he's a sort of personality that needs to be liked. And he finds it difficult to have to do things which maybe would shift people away from thinking of him as a sort of positive, kind of helpful, person that you like, and that kind of you see in that sort of positive way. And again, in a pandemic, making very difficult decisions, I think that's something which will potentially be a barrier. I also think there are personality challenges, or perhaps personality is the wrong word, but leadership challenges in actually some of the degree of loyalty that he has to the people working with him. And I think we've touched on the Dom Cummings issue, but I think you could probably level that at some other fiascos where perhaps it would have been better to see, maybe in the middle of a pandemic, firing a lot of people isn't the best thing, but certainly bringing other people in where you identify weaknesses in teams, in different departments. And I think we don't have the strongest cabinet, not just that they're inexperienced, but there are areas where there was clearly a sort of lack of leadership within individual departments that I think caused additional problems. But having said all that, I do think there were significant system issues that we would have to look at. And I agree entirely with Lord O'Donnell saying that we absolutely mustn't be looking back at those first few weeks or even months with the kind of hindsight we have now and saying, why didn't they do X, Y, and Z? Because we should always remember this was a novel virus at the time. We didn't know anything at all really about it. And I think it's remarkable where we've got to a year later in terms of scientific and medical advances. But I do think what we did lack was foresight. And what I mean by that was that the Prime Minister wasn't just inexperienced himself and walked in with a relatively inexperienced set of ministers and advisors around him. But actually, when we got to the point of knowing there was going to be a pandemic, he wasn't furnished with the sort of information and planning that you might want to have seen. So the fact that in the Far East they had SARS, and we didn't seem to have looked at that ahead of that, and we had been entirely obsessed with an influenza model, I think is a massive problem. So I would raise significant questions as to how we got to the degree of groupthink well before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, but to have not even considered that it might not be an influenza pandemic, despite the fact there was evidence internationally that SARS could be something that we may well face, I think is a huge issue, and that's a system issue. In terms of the actual response from a healthcare perspective, we lacked basic data and infrastructure to be able to respond. We didn't have the sort of operational information to know how many ventilators we had or how many care beds we had. We have no idea really what sort of infrastructure we have in social care. The data is appalling. So having to, in the middle of a crisis, you need real-time, high quality information that you can then have the structures, which is where the leadership comes in order to respond to that information. If the information that you have is poor or inadequate, that makes the leadership and decision making much more difficult. So I think there are some quite big system issues that we would have to reflect on, completely aside from the quality of the administration we had in place. And I also think there is some evidence of the machinery of government, and particularly, I think, some of the decisions taken within the NHS and NHS England and Public Health England, which, other people have already looked at, but I think we would want to also scrutinise. And, Nightingale hospitals are a great example of something which was done too late and then not used properly. But it has been suggested to us that that was partly because the plans for the Nightingale Hospital sat on a desk in the Department for Health for a while, and that's not a Prime Minister issue. So I think, yes, there were challenges with the Prime Minister, but I think this crisis has exposed actually both some brilliant things about government and the machinery of government, but also some quite significant flaws.
Yes. Charlotte, it's very interesting that you lit upon the cabinet, I thought, which, as Badger teaches us, is sort of the heart of the uncodified constitution that we have. And this seems to me very interesting and perhaps important, which is that Boris Johnson has built a cabinet based on loyalty rather than competence. And this has had significant consequences, I think, and interested to see if you agree, which is that, for instance, during his illness, it was quite clear that there was a vacuum. And he himself joked about the prospect of his own mortality, referred to as the death of Stalin, which is rather a psychologically revealing comparison. And then when he made the decision to lock down again over Halloween, which we reported on, what's interesting is his reticence in, as it were, adjudicating between his colleagues. There are definite tensions by that stage between Rishi Sunak on the one hand, Matt Hancock and Michael Gove on the other. And he, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, appears almost to withdraw from the fray at a time when strong leadership is needed. So I just wonder, on the specific question of cabinet management, how you'd rate it.
I think part of the challenge, and this is not trying to avoid answering it, I think part of the challenge is that it's not just that you've got a divided cabinet and you have a Prime Minister who perhaps is, kind of more reluctant to sort of be taking one side or the other. But I think within the advisory group around the Prime Minister, you didn't have a strong enough body of people to enable the decisions to be made in the sort of, kind of timely way that I guess, Matthew, you're alluding to. So, we obviously had the departure of Dom Cummings and Lee Kane. We've obviously now had appointments for people replacing, but clearly within number 10, the advisor network wasn't also in place in order to enable the Prime Minister, I guess, to feel more supported in that decision-making process. And I think, we have focused very much throughout this period on Dom Cummings as an individual, but actually I think there are a lot more questions to ask about the setup within number 10 more broadly and whether the right people were there. Both actually to act as the traditional gatekeeper models, the people to say to the PM, actually, you need to take a step back, or you need to go and talk to these people, the sort of the people that fix the things, if you like, around the Prime Minister. And I think that was lacking. And I think that makes it much more difficult then, where you have the sort of division that you clearly have. And, it's worth saying that, Lord O'Donnell will know this kind of much better than I would do. But I think every person who gets put into a department suddenly becomes very native to that department and very sort of loyal to that department. So I think it's not surprising that we saw those divisions. And I think we early on didn't have nearly enough conversation about the trade-offs actually in terms of health, social and economic. But I think part of the problem was actually that second lockdown decision period happened at a time when actually number 10 in more broadly was in quite disarray.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Can I turn to Alex Thomas of the Institute for Government next? Alex, good morning. Thank you very much for your time and joining us. The IFG does an enormous amount of work on policy and government, and has become kind of a place we turn to for guidance on this issue. But I'm very interested in a specific question on, as it were, the concepts involved here, and how you rate Boris Johnson's conceptual grasp of what he was dealing with. Because, as we know, he's proud of his cakeism, as it's become called, the having a cake and eating it. And, to Charlotte's point about not being aware sufficiently early, or not dealing with sufficiently early the trade-offs involved. From the start, he seems to embrace the concept of herd immunity and then just drop it in favor of a lockdown policy, then shift in late June, early July to a slow liberation policy, and then revert to a lockdown policy after the tiering process has failed. I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, do you think he has his record on understanding what he's coping with, how should we rate that?
Thanks, and thank you for having me here. It's a fascinating discussion. If the question is get inside the mind of Boris Johnson. I'm not sure any of us can quite do that, but I think you're right to highlight the some of the sort of tensions that exist sort of in the person of Boris Johnson. We see boosterist Johnson, we see wartime leader Johnson, we see fight them on the beaches and so on. But I think this goes a little bit to what you were asking Charlotte and Gus about, but there's something very early on in the crisis about the almost a sort of psychological enormity of the decisions that were being asked to make. And I do actually think this points to some of the supposed delays early in February and March. And there is a case for the defence, if we do try and sort of cast our minds back then, that the decisions that Johnson and the government were being asked to make were so enormous that it seemed almost inconceivable. And some of the work we've done, trawling through the SAGE minutes and recognising the lack of information that was there at the time, suggests that actually one of the barriers was that there was a presumption not to act when the decisions and the consequences of the decisions were so significant. And I think that combined with the personality of the Prime Minister meant that some of the decisions took longer. I also think there's something about, you were talking with Charlotte and with Gus about the distinction between the style of the government and the structural questions and the structures that were there to respond to the crisis. And I do think that's an important distinction, that what's in the hands of the Prime Minister and what is more due to the system. And I think one of the things that absolutely is in the hands of this Prime Minister is the style of his government and the tone that he sets. And it's become a truism that particularly before Dominic Cummings departed, this was a government that was good at campaigning and not so good at actually governing. And that played out, I think, both in the personality of the Prime Minister, but also in the personality of the government as a whole. It was about dividing rather than unifying. It was about briefing and sort of playing the media rather than clear, sober, calm, consistent messages. It was about making appointments based on loyalty and politics rather than necessarily competence. And so I think that was one of the sort of the decisions that was in the Prime Minister's hands that reflected his personality. I think another was the instinct to centralise and to draw everything in. And I think that's a really, again, others have touched on it, but that's a really important point about understanding the government's response so far. And centralising is not all bad. There were problems with centralising, and I think absolutely overriding some of the local authority mechanisms and structures on test and trace, I think mishandling some of the relationships with the devolved administrations, all legitimate criticisms of a centralising government, but maximising leverage on vaccination, being able to roll out in the early phases of the pandemic an enormous, if poorly targeted, but correctly poorly targeted programme of economic support. The fact that the Treasury, HMRC and the Department for Work and Pensions were in control of that and centralised that was actually a strength in the UK's response, because it could happen really quickly and it could get out there. And then I won't labour it, but some of the structural points which aren't the Prime Minister's immediate fault, I think, come into play. Three briefly to highlight in particular. One, we're a highly centralised country with an incredibly weak centre. And I think that famous story about Johnson looking across the table at Mark Sedwill saying, "Who's in charge of this?" and Mark Sedwill saying, "You are." I mean, that's, for me, I'd be interested in Gus's views on this, but that a Prime Minister deserves a stronger answer than that. The centre can, we have an implementation unit, we have a delivery team, they are driving this through. And I think it doesn't need to be a big centre, but it does need to be a strong and powerful centre that can then give the Prime Minister confidence when he delegates matters out to departments or to local government, that they're being held accountable and that he is in control because his head's on the line. Two final very brief points about the structure of government. One, I think Charlotte made the point about failing to anticipate for a coronavirus pandemic and being focused on influenza. I think that's right, but there's a deeper point for me that is that even accepting that we were planning for an influenza pandemic, that had sat at the top of the National Risk Register for years, and yet seemed to be kept in contingency planning, civil contingency secretariat bubble. So why did the Department for Education not have a plan for responding even to pandemic influenza, let alone a novel coronavirus? There's something about the contingency structures in the British state reaching deeper into individual departments and different policy areas. And then the final thing, I think, and you can't blame Boris Johnson for this, is and this is not one government, it's not just the Cameron Osborne era of austerity, but a focus over decades on the sort of trimming back the capacity of the state, focusing on efficiency. That's all kind of right and correct, but I think that led to a reduced capacity of the state in contingency terms, and so a sort of lack of flexibility and resource available for any prime minister dealing with this. I've meandered away from your original question, Matthew, but those are my thoughts.
I mean, one sort of related thing I wanted to ask was that the sort of quest for a narrative, the meandering quest for a narrative rather than a strategy. So one of the features of the Prime Minister's sort of approach to this, and it's been one that's been mimicked by his those who serve him in cabinet, is a kind of boosterism. So everything, however manifestly not so, is described as world-beating. And this is quite this I think is novel and a populist characteristic. And I just wonder, you know, as someone whose days are spent analysing government, what you think the implications of that have been, because they've really, especially when we were having the daily press conferences, there was a kind of bombardment of boosterish language that was clearly at odds with what was actually happening on the ground.
I think that's right. And I think one of the characteristics of boosterous language is that it's quite content free. And we've seen, I think, and this has been playing out in the last couple of weeks, I don't think the Prime Minister or ministers have been clear enough about explaining and teaching. I think the language has been, it's not always been consistent. I think that has undermined public confidence to some extent, but I also think it's playing out with Conservative Party backbenchers at the moment. So lots of debate currently about cost-benefit analyses and assessments of what the economic impact of the lockdown is, as well as the health impact. Now there are, and Gus has talked eloquently about this, but there are obviously ways that you can trade those things off. But I think the gap there is actually about detailed explanation and opening up of the decisions that the Prime Minister is making. And I think people will be quite sympathetic about that if he were able to explain more credibly the sort of trade-offs that he's making, which doesn't necessarily mean we're trading off X% here for Y number of deaths there, but it does mean bringing more content into his language and bringing more teaching, more explanation in a kind of calm and sober way that lets people in on his decision making. And as I say, not just the public, but his own backbenchers that I would say he'd then have an easier time politically about as well.
Thank you, Alex. Can I just go back to Gus briefly? Gus, we haven't really dealt with the question of Johnson's illness. Now, obviously, none of us are medical practitioners, so we can't judge. We can't judge specifically how his symptoms emerged, how well the system responded to dealing with him. Although it would appear that the medical care he received in number 10 was not great. I suppose the question I'm asking is more of a systemic one, which is, I mean, let's start with a personal question, which is, do you think better, or do you think he was allowed to convalesce sufficiently? And B, how did the system cope with what was a crisis within a crisis?
Very hard to comment on your first point about was he allowed to convalesce well. without knowing much more about his medical state. So I can't really comment on that. What I would say is, in these systems, prime ministers matter a lot. I mean, there's Charlotte and Alex made some very good points, but the one when you were asking about cabinet really isn't appropriate as a decision-making vehicle in times of crisis, right? You need to bring cabinet along, but it's too big, it's too slow, and you need something faster. And you need a really engaged prime minister. And yes, at times they do need to get into more detail than this prime minister seems to be fond of. So I'd say obviously they didn't expect him to get ill, so the structures that were there to replace a prime minister weren't as great, and you've got as you say, a relatively inexperienced cabinet, so there wasn't an obvious second leader. When Dominic Raab stood in, I think he made a point of trying to be not a deputy prime minister. He wasn't given that title, and he kind of stood back. He didn't want to be a strong leader. I would say, while I've got the floor, that I think there were some issues that people have raised that are worth looking at again. I mean, for example, this whole business about data. Actually, one of the advantages of being a very centralized economy and having a centralized NHS is that you get good data. You should do anyway. If you remember back to Blair and 4 hours A&E, we could kind of almost name the people, name the hospitals that were on the cusp of not meeting that target. So there were some advantages to this that somehow seem to have not been exploited. So I don't quite get that. There was definitely, I think as a prime minister, they should have thought about, in terms of language, you never in these circumstances overpromise and under-deliver. And on testing and all the rest of it, just awful. And I worry that we're going to get into the same situation with vaccines. Please learn that language, that point. And then language. I think there were some really serious errors made on language and the way we put these things across. So the whole business that was right from the start about social distancing that we're still using is completely, to my mind, the wrong term. What really matters is physical distancing. All right? We want social togetherness. Actually, one of the great advantages of this was people helping out their neighbours. So the phrase, which the WHO dropped after a while, of social distancing, was wrong. The use of a single R number. Early on, we had this thing, we've got to get R below 1, a completely meaningless concept for a national average R, when you knew that, if you're going to do this well, the things from Singapore and all the rest of it was you get very granular, very specific. So you need to be saying, actually, the average R is this, but, to be honest, what really matters is R's above 1 in these specific areas. We've got to do something about that. So moving from a world where you've kind of given this average for the nation to being more specific becomes harder because you haven't trained people that way. So I think there are some key things there. And I do think that business about whether we were prepared for flu is certainly true. I mean, during my day, we had the risk register. Pandemic was right up there, number one. We had contingency plans, but it was much more like flu. But we had stocks of PPE. We had all of this. The problem, as a number of people have mentioned, I think Charlotte picked this up. When you run and Alex, when you run the machine very hot, and we did run the health service very hot, right? You're running it close to capacity. You don't have much space for contingencies. And you can imagine that if you've got a budget and you're desperately trying to keep up, and we've seen that, we're starting to fall behind on all sorts of targets, cancer and all the rest of it. There's a great tendency to say, look, you've spent all this money, which has produced absolutely nothing, all this contingency money, and therefore we're going to stop doing that. We're going to put it somewhere else. So if there's a lesson from your inquiry, it would be, how do you ring fence contingency funds? How do you kind of stop them being raided along the way? And I stress, I would say for your inquiry, please don't think that the lessons from this should be about how to do COVID better next time. They should be broader than that. They should be, how do we manage a crisis? And it might be a cyber security crisis or something. But a key lesson would be, if you've got some contingency plans and you're therefore putting aside some money, don't let anyone raid it.
Guess, just on the final question on that, Mark Sedwell's response to the Prime Minister, you know, who's running this, I think you are Prime Minister. Is that fair? Because in the end, that's what this boils down to, is who's on the hook. Is it fair for the Cabinet Secretary to say, actually, Prime Minister, you know, in the end, the buck stops with you? Or should his response have been more nuanced? Yeah, and I don't even know if that conversation took place and in what context it was. All right, let's strip out the personalities as a principle, because we don't have a presidential system. To what extent is the response of a nation to a crisis like this to be laid at the feet of the person who holds the office of Prime Minister? Yes, I think the Prime Minister ultimately is the key decision maker. In crises, they lead the nation. You've seen the Prime Minister doing unusual things like broadcasting to the nation, all those sorts of things. So in that sense, they are the leader and they will be held accountable for it. That doesn't mean that they have to run everything. They absolutely need a strong system backing them up. They need a strong structures. You know, I'm quite critical of the structures that were set up. I think they were the wrong ones, but they do need a lot of help in these circumstances. So yes, the Prime Minister's out there as the front person, but actually they need massive support during crises. And you know, we need to be very open and transparent about this and say, well, to what extent did we during this episode find out that there were things about our systems which weren't as good as they should be, and how can we learn for the future? So I think we should do that in a very open way, and not, I think you're all being very careful about this, not just lessons from hindsight, but lessons from, given the knowledge we had at the time, what should we have done differently? Can I just go back? Thank you so much. Go back to Charlotte briefly. I mean, we've talked for almost an hour about this global problem dealt with at a national level, and the performance of an individual. How dependent? I mean, is the system too dependent upon the personality, strengths, and defects of an individual? And B, do you think that we would have handled this pandemic better if someone with perhaps a more technocratic mindset had been in the office?
So I don't think it is about one single individual. Where I entirely agree is ultimately the buck has to stop with the Prime Minister, and the ultimate accountability is with the Prime Minister. But if you think of the scale of the challenge and the scale of the crisis we've just gone through, I think it would be a bit absurd to say that success or failure, and however you want to measure that, entirely rests on who is occupying number 10 at that point at which a crisis hits. So I do think the individual is important, and my comments at the start about the sort of need for someone who does want to get a bit more into the detail, I think these are really important observations that are being made around the fact that we had someone who wasn't as willing to give a more nuanced narrative and perhaps be a bit more honest about what we didn't know and what we were learning in real time. And I think that was a problem, and having a technocrat may have been more helpful in those respects. Equally, you could have had a technocrat that was so steeped in the detail that you couldn't get any decisions made in a timely way. And crisis also requires rapid activity. So I don't think it is quite as simple as saying, you know, should we have had a technocrat versus a sort of boosterist kind of, you know, big personality, sort of sell the UK as the best in the world individual. I think it's about that person plus the machinery around them, and that's both the political machinery and the officials that are around them. And there's so many trade-offs that had to be made during this period. And one of the things that perhaps we haven't, Gus talked about there a brilliant point that we should always reflect on any public policy, which is that averages are deeply unhelpful in most instances. But actually, on the one hand, you have people saying, wasn't it terrible that the Prime Minister was presenting this single argument of stay at home, stay alert, protect the NHS at the start? But then also you've got people saying, but hold on a minute, then we wanted absolute clarity and we wanted people to know exactly what they were doing. So you've got all these tensions between local and national, between a very simple, understandable message and human behaviours and the need to have something a bit more nuanced. And I just think it's the whole machine and the system has to work with a very strong leader, yes, at the top, but everything else around that person has to be suitable for the moment you're in. And that's where I think we have to look much more broadly than just the PM.
Thank you so much, Ollie. We're already overrunning, but I do just want quickly to ask Alex a final question, which is, Alex, is it the case in some that the person who was ideally suited to quite ruthlessly actually force through the Brexit vote, purge his party, drive through by any means necessary the deal, and then win a general election, was also conversely totally ill-suited to dealing with something as granular, complex, and strategic as a pandemic?
So I think it's a really interesting point, and I think you're right that they are different skill sets, if I can be a bit sort of nuanced about it, in that it goes back to the point I made earlier about the campaigning is not governing. But you're right. Brexit, in the end, an enormous technical challenge, but in the end, it's a political art that is going to get us through the Brexit negotiations and the politics of it. I do think that is different from the skills that you need, the kind of calm, sober, dial it down, keep the rhetoric very sort of factual around a pandemic. But I don't think it's impossible for one Prime Minister, this Prime Minister, or any other, to be able to do both. And I think we're at a really interesting inflection point now. I think the departure of Dominic Cummings is significant. I think the appointment of Dan Rosenfield as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff is even more significant, because if this Prime Minister can keep his Tiggerish boosterism, but surround himself with a team that is more suitable to governing, there's a real moment for him to show that he can do both. And I think nothing is going to be more important for this government at all, I don't think, than vaccine rollout. If they get the vaccine rollout right, then the government is, saved. There's a really positive narrative, and on we go. If they get it wrong, that's going to fatally undermine any suggestion of competence. So this is the moment for Boris Johnson and his government to decide whether this reset really is real and is going to take effect. So I do think one Prime Minister can do both, but I think they need to know the people they should be leaning on and the advice they should be taking in order to be able to flex.
Thanks so much, Alex. I've run horribly over time, so I'm not going to go through the reams of notes that I've taken. Simply to say that I think there are some specific takeaways that fascinate me. One is the Gus's point about the failure to implement the correct strategic framework, and also to use the right agencies, accumulate the right data, learn the right lessons from Asia. And then the points made by Alex and Charlotte about systemic issues, and in particular the mismatch, I think, between the challenge, its psychological enormity, and perhaps the particular skill set and psychology that the Prime Minister has undoubtedly been part of this. And as Alex said just now, the third act of this will be vaccine rollout, and the perhaps history's verdict on the Prime Minister will ultimately depend on that as much as anything else that's happened to date. I could go on, but alas, I can't. But I would really like to thank Roch Alexei for their brilliant presentations at the start, and particularly our superb guests, Gus, Charlotte and Alex, for making such a wonderful start to our final day of the inquiry. You have a few minutes to refresh yourself before Chris Cook will be back to resume our investigation of the NHS. Meanwhile, thank you very much for coming to this first session. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you.